Charla is an award-winning documentarian and entrepreneur. I've been really delighted to get to know her over the last couple of months. She's also the co-founder and producer at Stacked Media, and Charla will be taking it over from me. Charla, if you could unmute.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nalini, so much for having me. This has been an amazing conversation, one that's definitely, hits near and dear to my heart. As I explained in my breakout room, even though I am now working in media, I have had a long and varied history. As I shared, I actually have experience in this area. I spent back in the late 90s. Oh, sorry. Anyway, I will talk about that later. But first, let's go into what we just our private conversations in our breakout rooms. I would love to connect with each of the facilitators and talk about some of the key points that we've taken away from our breakout rooms and discuss some solutions that the groups may have come to. Natalie?
Thank you so much. Yes. Wow, we had a lot that we talked about in our room, and I do hope I give this sharing out justice, because we had a lot of passionate people who had varying interests, but at the heart of it, a lot of concern just about doing the right thing. So in our room, we had representation from New York to Michigan to Morocco. I don't know if we have that on the map, Nalini, but we're putting Morocco on the map today. We talked, first and foremost, coming off of our opening speaker and his sharing, how very hard it is to drive change, because supply chains with regard to food are consolidated, and it makes it challenging then for change to happen. But at the heart of this, consumers can still make a big difference. We talked about the fact that you as an individual consumer should be interested in more food education. And we really saw that it was very important for people to understand not only what is in the foods that they're buying, what foods they're buying, what season they're buying things, but also whether things are as they seem. Consumers, the behavior of consumers impacts and drives change. So when you go to the supermarket and you're buying plant-based food, understanding what's in it and in some cases, maybe making a decision around whether it's worth buying it. We talked about a concept that I had not really heard about, but I looked it up when we were in discussion about greenwashing. And greenwashing is really companies that make claims about the effects of their products, their goods, and it not being true, and that having no consequences. So maybe some consequences around that. We talked about policies and the federal government's role around being consistent with policies, and also accountability to policies when it comes to food and regulations and giving grants and different things around food. While we're thrilled to be good consumers to be buying certain products, we have to learn more about the process that some of these foods go through, and the fact that in order to make it from the ground to the supermarket to your table, there's a lot of carnage. There's a lot of things that happen that are negative, and are actually eroding the good that you think you're investing in as a consumer. So definitely knowledge and knowledge of alternatives. We talked about the fact that it would be so wonderful for us as consumers to think about, and this came from one of our contributors, whether you really need that fresh mango in the middle of winter. because in order for that mango to get to you, the carbon footprint may be enormous. And so maybe we need to adjust and we need to settle for what is the seasonal crop that is local, that is better, because it does two things. It supports local industry, and it also reduces that carbon footprint. You know, how much should we contribute back as consumers to support local farming and the ideas around localization? How do we avoid being extreme and eliminate some of the dangers? It's all about balance. And so definitely amplifying issues of concern around food, where it comes from, how it gets to us. We also, at the very end, just started to talk about food deserts, right? Something that was explosive during this pandemic was that people who live in certain urban areas had no access to good, fresh food. And, you know, we were just beginning to talk about the confusion between nutrition and access to food. As a nation right now, and looking at all of the important things that are impacting our societies and groups, food education, access to fresh food, understanding the food chain is really important. And so, you know, not only are we applauding the new alternatives that are coming up that our opening speaker talked about, things that hopefully will create better change, but as consumers, we can do something differently. We can make different choices. We can force ourselves to not be so bougie and need to have certain foods all the time, because then we are actually contributing to the problem. And I know there were many other things that I could have reported on, but I think those were the main ideas: being smarter, being more receptive, and using our senses to determine better choices. When we go to the supermarket, buying the first, you know, cantaloupe that we pick up instead of squeezing it to death, and then having food waste from the supermarkets, which is also a huge problem, right? All of the fresh produce and things that we find that are not acceptable for our table then create enormous waste in other ways. And I think those were the main things that I wanted to bring out from the group conversation, and just thank everyone in the room for their contributions. This was only the surface of the things that we discussed. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. That was amazing, very comprehensive, and looking at things on a micro and macro level. Next, we have Marie Bailey. Hi, Marie.
So I hope I do justice to this. The group was fascinating, absolutely, and many different ideas and things that are actually happening now that I happen to know of. One is just changing one's diet to have a plant-based diet, and I would say complementing that, finding a way to have a mini garden. If you have an apartment, you can grow tomatoes in a pot. I have a friend in Philadelphia who grows her own lettuce. You know, she has a very small apartment, but she has a lettuce out on her balcony. She tells me how she plants it, and it's growing it, and it's sustainable throughout the summer. The other thing is community gardens, and community gardens educate community. They not only educate the adults who are doing the community garden, but they also educate the children who are part of the community garden. And I know here in Huntington, the town of Huntington, and this is all over in all different levels. This is in Huntington Station. This is in Northport. It's in East Northport. There are these gardens where people absolutely love to get together to have their boxes of vegetables, and they grow so much that they donate a great deal to the food pantries. So in the summertime, as long as they can go from the time they begin in, say, June, all the way into October. I mean, the truth is gardens go into October, sometimes in November with, your winter vegetables, and beginning to know your vegetables and what they are and what you have and what you can do with them. Um, and and the other thing is, I think, let's see, well, that you were mentioning about soil, the creating rich soil um, from what you have, and that's really important. And learning how to do that. I myself have a barrel of red wiggler worms that in the wintertime I keep in the barrel in my kitchen so they don't freeze. And I throw food scraps in there. And then it builds up. And I'll tell you, what I've used, my my plants are enormous. And it's all natural. I don't like to use fertilizer. I don't like to use weed killer, any of those things. Um, I think one of the another main point was made that we've got to catch the gaps. We've got to where there's additional food sources. We have to have appropriate refrigeration, appropriate storage, and money needs to go into that system. And lastly, the idea came up about capitalism, like, the money is made by having more. So, I think we all agreed with the idea, well, maybe the alternative routes need to be popularized. They need to be the fun thing to do. One of our members said she was a vegan when she was 11 years old and people made fun of her. Now it's easy to be a vegan. There's so many different types of food that you can eat, and being a vegan or vegetarian is not a big deal. And that's beginning to be true. Like, people are becoming more acceptable of your of your eating habits. It's you as an individual, and this is what you eat, and it's quite okay. But making the alternative idea, a popular one. And I would mention, I think Michelle Obama had a lot to do with educating the American people about the importance of gardening and healthy food. So the beginning has happened. It just needs to be continued, by all of us. And it's a really fun thing to do if we want to do it, if we're committed to do it. So thank you very much. I hope I represented my group fairly well. I enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie. Next, we have Francis.
Okay, thank you.
Clifton.
Yeah. As always, we have a really fascinating group with different people from around the world sharing. First started off with Bernadette from Ireland, who grew up on the farm of west of Ireland. And she now lives in the city of Dublin. And she shared how hard it is to find any really nutritious, appealing vegetables, as opposed to when she goes down to her mother's farm, she can pick carrots, the size of baseball bats, with mud on them and heavy greens. And she also pointed out how that some of the old locals who haven't really gotten into like really industrialized farming, just letting nature produce and protect the soil and turn itself over, or producing more of the healthier crops. Maybe too much intervention was, is questioned, and that was a really good point. And then we talked about how a large part was talked about, there was another and very important point about, in educating people about plant-based food, or that they were seemingly healthier. And then a young woman brought up the whole idea of like the cultural difference of selling these. It's just very hard for people like to convert if they're so used to, meat eating, and and to make it convert it right away. So that really has to be policy interventions of of education, the benefits of this, and then in the finding a cost-effective way of that. And then it was brought up, about two driving forces, and like in colonial times, the colonial powers would determine what crops were grown and what was distributed, and and that was a heavy burden. It was pointed out how when England took over India, they Indians were not allowed to sell their own salt. They had to take English salt, where England's, and they determined so many things, and not only all colonial powers would do that. So it seemed to to intervene with the agricultural market, and then we moved to the idea that, well, now it's sort of the huge corporations that are making the choices about what's being grown, as opposed to the colonial powers. But it's still a power structure, and it's still, I live around a lot of small farmers upstate New York, and they struggle mightily, competing with these huge corporate farms, and and in order to survive at the markets, their organic vegetables and fruits, are more costly. And we try the best we can to support them, but it's, there's that economic, um, unfairness. Um, and I guess that, that's free market capitalism. But, and then, the greenwashing, was a huge part of our discussion, where, what is really real. Because that's driven by capitalism, driven by the fact that let's sell this as it's better, but is it? And that's the question that we have to really educate ourselves, and develop, try to pressure governments to really thoroughly do the research on that. So that was a robust conversation about that. And then Joe in our group, he shared very end, where he was really, he's working a long time with, a group of medical schools and doctors and nutritionists to to research this understanding of greenwashing, where maybe some of these things are just not as good as they say, or at the very least they're the same, and they're just substituting one thing for another, and there's no really economic advantage. And oftentimes there's not even a health advantage, So, everyone shared deeply. And then Joe ended up with the point, as we ran out, I was like, people really have to dig into their souls and say what's important to them, what's really important nutritionally, and with the way they want to live their life. And, as a guiding point. And the more people we can get involved with that question and then apply it to food, it's beneficial. So it was a very, a group that really was quite stimulating, and I thank you all for sharing.
Thank you so much to all the facilitators for leading your respective rooms. Wow, thank you. This topic is near and dear to my heart, as I had mentioned before. It is so clear, the intersection between the change in our climate, the lack of access to affordable food, the changes in our in the lack of nutrition really in our soil, and also and also just the future of humanity as a whole. Over the last 20 years, I've spent, as I was stating earlier, I've spent a lot of time moving within this space. Actually, I worked in the EPA, and where the government had just formulated a program turning our waste into fertilizer pellets as part of the subsidy program. I've spent some time in farming in a foreign country as well, and have done some graduate research work around the impact of economic of tourism on both agriculture and then towards destination sites. What is very clear is that right now, if we don't change in terms of capitalism, there is a lack of access to affordable food. And this should not be the case. We have more than enough land mass to feed people. We as humanity, we need to be able to decentralize and you know, this concept of commercial farming. I think that's the one thing that we have seen across, I think, all the groups, is that this is the one fallacy that we do have. The emphasis on commercialized farming, and that is obviously due to our high consumption rate of various different products that require this sort of intensive extraction of nutrients from our soil. So we have to definitely address the gaps that are creating these economic systems that are preventing people from, you know, from getting access to healthy food from both a rural and urban standpoint. Because as one of the breakout groups said, there definitely are food deserts in urban areas, and this needs to definitely be addressed. And one way we've heard that's been consistent across all groups are community gardens. And this is definitely a viable option for communities. We need to encourage our respective local governments to create more and more green spaces, more and more of these community gardens. Another thing that seems very consistent across all the breakout rooms was the fact that corporations, a lot of them that purport to be green or sustainable are actually just in fact perpetuating a marketing scheme that we call greenwashing, where it's almost like a smoke and mirror sort of public relation move by a lot of these Fortune 500 companies. And so that leads us to know that as consumers, we must hold all brands that we take in, that we consume, that we must hold them accountable, obviously. And the way to do that is through our dollars and not supporting companies that continue to perpetuate these false, sustainable PR campaigns. In terms of organizing, it is up to each of us. Personally, this has led me to media, because I personally have seen the effects that media has played in shaping people's perceptions around issues. What mainstream media narratives have done in molding public opinion is fascinating to me, but it's also dangerous because when we talk about mainstream media, we're talking about propaganda, whether it's good or bad. And a lot of us, we don't realize like how susceptible we are to that. And so it's a great way for us to organize, is to become educated and to look at independent media sources that are shining the light on these various social issues, like food security, to educate ourselves so that we can figure out on an individual basis how we will do our part to impact the bigger picture. And that is my takeaway from this. So in terms of my own personal calls to action, and I challenge each of you to think about these breakout rooms that you each have individually been in, and to adopt some of the suggestions that were made in your groups. So thank you very much, everyone. And it's been great. Thanks, thank you so much, Nalini, for having me here. Sorry, I was a little tongue-tied. This has been a fantastic discussion.
No problem. Thank you, Charlotte.
you.
Thank you so much.